Welcome to another episode of the KUBIK Report. This is the 15th podcast with Greg Thomas, and I'm happy once again to have him joining us here. The last few times we have been discussing effective communication skills. Today we'll be covering conversational terrorism. Going all the way back to August of 2022, Greg and I have been discussing an ongoing series of thought-provoking topics on the subjects of personal leadership development and business leadership. Greg is a business consultant, author, keynote speaker, and a personal life coach that I got to know very well over a decade ago. As a reminder, you can learn more about Greg's training skills on his YouTube channel. Simply type in Leadership Excellence channel on the YouTube homepage search bar, and you will find him. In the past, we have spoken with Greg about a lot of interesting topics, including personal leadership development, business leadership, servant leadership, how to have a fulfilling and productive day, the common misconceptions about the law of attraction, and most recently, effective communication. So, Greg, welcome to our 15th podcast together.
Well, thank you, Vic. It's a pleasure. It's been a while. I unfortunately had some health challenges that I've been dealing with, but I am back in the saddle again and excited about being part of your podcast today.
Well, we're so glad to have you here. I know that you've had your health challenges. We've done 14 podcasts, and I was not going to bother you about it anymore. And you offered to come back, and I am just so thrilled. I was so very happy. My wife and I were talking about how happy we are to have you back. The topic of conversational terrorism is one that has intrigued me. I had seen a posting on the internet, would you believe, 28 years ago when I began my own website. Back in the days of, the caveman internet was all dial-up. But I did find one site that had this list of conversational terrorism terms. And I found it to be very, very truthful. I found it to be shocking and even hilarious about the things that we say. And even the authors themselves were self-effacing, saying, hey, this is the way sometimes we talk and the way we don't really want to talk. But what's interesting, what really kind of drove me partially to choose this topic in the leadership series are two things. Number one, Greg has been talking about communication. Secondly, in the year 2022, Merriam-Webster's word of the year was gaslighting. You've probably heard that term, gaslighting. And gaslighting is the act or practice of grossly misleading someone, especially for one's own advantage. And it's done through words. It's done through the things that we say. And in 2022, there was almost a 1,740% increase in lookups for gaslighting. So it is a term that people use. I hear it on broadcast television. So, Greg, to you, conversational terrorism. Is it a serious problem in your work with consulting and working with people and how they express themselves?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, Vic, I think it's the worst problem that it's ever been, primarily because of social media. People anonymously type things on a keyboard 1,000 miles away and post them on the internet, and that makes them feel energized. They get responses from that. It makes them feel like they're in control. And a lot of that communication is very negative, is contrary to what we've been discussing up to this point. And there are a lot of conversational terrorists out there due to social media. And it has also influenced virtually every part of our culture, from business organizations to politics to the news media. It is a very serious problem, no doubt about it.
Well, I'm so glad that you were able to express that, because in my own world, which is not as vast as yours in the consulting world, but I've noticed that people have fire come out of their eyes and out of their fingertips on the keyboard, knowing that they can say it and walk away, and not realizing the effect it has. I know I had one employee one time. I said, do not send any memos out anymore until I see them. I said, they are offensive, to people.
Sure. Yep.
And I don't know if you realize that, but they are offensive in the tone.
Yeah, let me give you a definition of conversational terrorism. Like any type of terrorist, what you're trying to do is you're trying to blow something up, right? You're trying to distract someone from getting across their idea or their theme. It's a conscious or unconscious effort to put another person on the defensive during a conversation. Its goal is to either demean or humiliate another person, or to make yourself appear superior to another person by using gunpowder phrases or words. It has no desire to seek truth or to understand, and we've talked about the importance of seeking first to understand, Stephen Covey principle. It has no desire to do any of those things. It only wants to win an argument, and is commonly used by a person with low emotional intelligence, someone who's very emotional, someone who must win, must be right, which is a common characteristic in human nature, and they want to avoid truth. They want to avoid logic. Oftentimes they want to avoid science because it may prove them to be wrong. So they deflect the real topic by using conversational terrorism. And again, it is quite prevalent in our culture today.
I was, in preparation for this podcast, was going to go back to my old standby, How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. And as I was, I couldn't find it, so I thought, well, maybe I could get a Kindle copy of it. What I did find, though, that book has been updated with a section now called How to Win Friends and Influence People in the Digital Age. And I thought that's interesting. I find that it's becoming such a need, more than just in face-to-face, but in the digital way which we interact with one another more. So I'm finding out it was a addition to the book by his daughter, nice. I believe.
Yeah, great. Yeah, very talented man, a great book, a classic. Let me talk about some types of conversational terrorism. Some of these are kind of humorous, and frankly, some of these are kind of sad. One of them is what I'll call over your head. And it implies, I'm not quite sure you can understand this. It's implying that you don't have the intelligence to really grasp and understand my point or my position. And again, you're trying to put the person on the defensive. You're in essence implying that they're stupid or they lack intelligence or the mental acuity to grasp something. That's called over your head. Another one is called even you. And it comes out something like this: even you should be able to grasp or understand this. And again, it is humiliating, it is demeaning, and it's going to obviously put a person on the defensive. Another one is that you'll get over it. And it basically implies that as you mature, either, physically, intellectually, or spiritually, you'll grow out of your present view and you'll agree with me. So again, is this that attempt to demean someone, to belittle them, make them feel small, and that's called you'll get over it. Another one is wishful thinking. And you only believe that because of some deep-seated idea or some suppressed emotion that's common among those who have suffered emotional traumas. So you're basically telling the person they're emotionally immature and they held that idea or thought because they have some deep-seated trauma or emotional issue in which they probably need to have therapy. And that's why they say the things they do and to believe what they believe. Another one is nitpicking. That's one of my favorite ones. To avoid dealing with the comment or idea directly, one focuses on an insignificant detail to avoid the major issue or to stall. Sometimes they're trying to buy time. It'll go something like this. Well, you said that this happened last Monday around midnight. Well, actually, after midnight, it was Tuesday. Well, technically that may be correct, but it has absolutely nothing to do with the topic at hand. Again, its idea is to deflect you, to break your thought pattern, and to put you on the defensive that you just don't have the facts, you don't have command of the facts like the other person does.
I might just mention one permutation here that I've heard publicly, about commenting about somebody else in kind of a backward way. Some people have said this person has been a crook. He's been dishonest. He's been mentions all these things. But I totally disagree with that, and I stand behind this person. But in the meantime, you said all these things about him.
Sure, that's right.
It's a backhanded compliment. I've seen that happen a number of times.
Yeah, that is very true. There are all kinds of types. Another one is called out of context, or we could call it nitpicking 2.0. And that's where you purposely focus on a word or a phrase to shift the focus away from the topic at hand to distract the person onto that phrase. Something like this: you said you feel, instead of using the word think. I won't be able to convince you if you're feeling instead of using reason. So again, it's a backhanded remark. It's saying you're too emotional. You can't understand and grasp this until you stop being emotional, and you just take one little word out of, what might have been a sentence of 40 words, and you focus on that in order to draw it out of context to take everyone off of topic. Another one is a heat-seeking question, and you throw the person's competence in doubt, and you also change the question at the same time. So it has two benefits. You put the person down and you change topic. And it might be something like this. You mentioned the U.S. Constitution. Who wrote it and how many days did it take him to write it? Mm-hmm. Again, usually that has no idea of anything to do with the question at hand, but it's a heat-seeking question. It's trying to put the person on the defensive. Very few people will know all that information, and it makes the person who originally made a statement look like they don't have all the knowledge that they have. And that's called the heat-seeking question. Another one, this is similar to what you just brought up, Vic. It's called I'm not saying this. And it's a way to come across as caring, but saying things that otherwise would be considered rude. And it might be something like this: I don't care about the negative things so many other people say about you. Mm-hmm. Now, again, you're implying like you're really caring and you love the person, but you just basically put them down and said the majority of people, so many other people, just don't agree with what you have to say. Another way of saying it is I personally don't want to spend time in this, but other people say. Mm-hmm. So again, it's just I'm not saying this, but I'm putting the blame on other people, on other situations, but I really am saying it. Another example is I'm right by association. And this implies that smart people agree with me while the uneducated agree with your view. And the phrase is like, well, the best scholars believe, mm-hmm. or the majority of people agree with me that, so that's I'm right by association. Again, it may have nothing to do with logic, facts, science, or anything else, but association makes me right. And then there's the cheap shot.
Yeah.
We see this a lot in politics today. And that's when you bring up an embarrassing mistake or history of another person to put on them and to make them defensive or humiliate them. You might say something like, did you talk like this when you were married? Implying, they've had a bad marriage and it's the way they communicated that was the problem. Another one that I've heard personally is, did you learn that at AA meetings? Again, implying that you're an alcoholic. Yeah. And you must have heard this at AA meetings because you're not right. And again, those are cheap shots. Politicians are really good at those kinds of things. So there are others, but those are the major types of conversational terrorism that occur in our world today.
Well, I have found that when we went through some theological issues in the church one time, that we had our own way of talking and discussing things. And then all of a sudden, when you bring up a question that you really want to discuss, well, I don't know if I understand the harmatology of that, or I don't understand the soteriology of that. Are you sure about your eschatology? I mean, you bring up about the Holy Spirit. Are you sure about the pneumatology of the whole subject? Oh, I guess I don't. And all of a sudden, you're the dummy, because sure. you don't talk their language. And right, I have found that to be a put down where somebody takes a course and learns a lot of, kind of an index of words, uses it against the person to put him down.
Sure.
Well, let's talk a little bit about when we are confronted with verbal terrorism, which we have. I know that I had one one time somebody sent a real sharp memo. I mean, it was just, really off the wall by somebody who really should have known better. And basically, I just ignored it. Just ignored it. In fact, I know that with one of our chairmen of the past, he had, he has a button on his computer or his phone. It's called the ignore button. He just pushes it. I'm just not going to deal with that, or else I'm going to say, would you please rephrase this question? And,
Sure, right.
But perhaps you could tell us a little bit about how to deal with some of these things that really are insulting. You know it, you feel it, and you have to work with it. Sometimes it's by somebody who is your superior. And how do you deal with it?
Sure. Vic, that is an excellent question. If I may ask permission, since we've defined conversational terrorism and we talked about some of the types, I'd like to give you a classic example of conversational terrorism, and then I will answer your question if I have your permission.
Absolutely.
To do that. Okay, great. So I want to give everyone a recent example, something that they would be familiar with. And again, this is not political. This is not about Democrat versus Republican. I mean, my personal feelings are that politicians are like diapers. They need to be changed regularly for the same reason. So I'm not political. I really don't care about politicians. I really don't care about Democrat versus Republican. What I'm about to bring out here, the question, as with any major issue, should always be what is wrong, not who is wrong. So I'm not going to focus on personalities. But recently we had a presidential debate in the United States. And you knew they were in trouble because the individuals didn't shake hands before or after the debate. They obviously do not like each other. And if you take all of the types that we just discussed, you will find that they violated every one of those types in that debate. Everything we said you shouldn't do, and here's what it is, and here's what it's called. They did every one of those things. Virtually every one of the types of conversational terrorism was on national display. Both used cheap shots to humiliate their opponent. And this was done so they didn't need to talk about the details of their vision for the country, if they even have a vision, or future ideas for the nation. All they did was take cheap shots at each other. An example, one individual said, "We finally beat Medicare." And his opponent said, "Well, he's right. He did beat Medicare. He beat it to death." And, yuck, yuck, yuck. Everybody has a good laugh at that. But the whole night was basically composed of two individuals lying constantly, exaggerating constantly. They often quoted other people to put their opinion or their opponent on the defensive. They called each other whiners, losers, suckers, molesting a woman in public, morals of an alley cat, the worst president ever. And again, all of these were conversational terrorism to distract from having to look into the camera and tell the nation about your vision for the nation and how the nation can grow and become better and meet the needs of its people. We saw repeated mantras. On one side, it was the idea that, obviously a talking point that he had been prepped for by his team. And so many ways he started, well, the idea that, and then the other individual, his opponent, the greatest ever or the worst ever in history. And of course, the greatest, by some coincidence, was always something he had done. And the worst ever in history was always something his opponent had done. So after taking these types that we discussed earlier, if you listen to the debate with that list of types, you will have a whole new understanding of what communication shouldn't be. I think that debate, for example, should be shown in every communication college in the United States on what not to do, how not to communicate. In contrast to this, they recently had elections in the UK, the United Kingdom, and the losing party leader said this. This is in contrast to the American debate. I'm going to quote him here. He said, quote, "While he has been my political opponent, Sir Keir Starmer will shortly become our prime minister. In this job, his successes will be all our successes. And I wish him and his family well. Whatever our disagreements in this campaign, he is a decent, public-spirited man who I respect. He and his family deserve the very best of our understanding as they make the huge transition to their new lives behind this door, and as he grapples with the most demanding of jobs in an increasingly unstable world."
Mm-hmm. Wonderful.
So not trying to be offensive, right? No gunpowder words, no last shot, last chance at conversational terrorism. Now that he lost the election, he was a big enough human being to understand the importance of really good and quality communication.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to point that out because I think it's very important that we look at a recent example that most people can relate to, or at least if they didn't see it, go on YouTube and watch it. And again, it is just loaded with conversational terrorism. Frankly, I think it's an embarrassment to Americans, the way they conducted themselves. Doesn't set a very good example for the world. And some people internationally had to look at those two individuals and say, in a nation of 300 plus million people, this is the best you have to offer, the best America has to offer the world. So it is absolutely incredibly sad, a really poor example. Now I'm going to answer your question.
Okay.
Any comments you want to make before
No,
I answer your question?
I find that people communicate in different venues to express things.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, some of the comments that were made in the debate were, if they were said in normal circumstances, people would be suing people for the comment.
Exactly.
I mean, for slander, for terrible things. But it's allowed, so to speak, in that particular thing, which is terrible because it shows that that's what they're really thinking. And there's no real change. There's no real desire. There's no real love, if you want to put that way. And there are just those different ways and venues that people can just blurt out these things, which makes it very sad. But go ahead and answer the question.
Yeah, you're right. It does make it sad. And it's an example that our young people see, and they think it's all right. Business people see that kind of conduct on television. The last two who could be leaders of the free world, and they begin to think that that kind of conduct is acceptable and is all right. And that's the real shame of it all. So how can we avoid conversational terrorism? Well, the first thing, of course, is don't use it yourself. Model the effective and positive communication skills that we've been talking about in a lot of the previous podcasts. We methodically went through some of the things that Stephen Covey said and why he said them and what he meant. In another podcast, we went through some qualities of effective and good communication. So set the right example. Don't use it yourself. Don't introduce it into the conversation because the other person then has an excuse to begin using it themselves. When it is first brought up, try to ignore it as long as you can. If the person sees that it doesn't work, if they're seeing that you're not going to take the bait, that you're not being rattled, that you're not being distracted from their conversational terrorism, they're less likely to use it. Mm-hmm. And if it isn't working, they may stop using it. If they don't stop using it, if it's continued, then patiently bring it up when it's being used and point it out. I heard what you said, but can we please get back to the original topic? Mm-hmm. Yes, that was funny, but can we please get back to the topic at hand and not discuss tangent issue or something else? We are here to discuss XYZ. Can we please stay on topic? And you call the person out on it and bring it up when they do. If it continues, then another thing you can do is have your important discussions along with a third party. That third party can be either a person that you know is an excellent communicator or a group, a committee or whatever that is composed of some people who are excellent communicators, and they should be able to intervene at the point where someone begins using conversational terrorism. And it's more powerful when a third party says, hey, John, I'm sorry. That comment is unacceptable, and that has nothing to do with our conversation here. Mark asked you a question. Can you please respond to his question rather than trying to deviate from it, going on a tangent or whatever? So if you have someone who has that emotional intelligence as a third person, third party, or a group of individuals that at least have some people that are like that, then they should be able to intervene or point out when someone is using conversational terrorism. And when it's pointed out enough, believe me, that person will stop using it, because now they've been put on the defensive in a tactful way. Now they see it isn't working. Now other people are pointing out to them, making them defensive of using that kind of communication trick or tactic in their conversations. So those are some of the things you can do to avoid conversational terrorism. In a culture where it is rewarded, it will continue. One common theme of humanity is you always get more of if you reward it, right? If you reward dysfunction, guess what you get?
Dysfunction.
You get more dysfunction. Absolutely. So if your business culture, if your church culture, if your family culture does not accept conversational terrorism and points it out when it's used, people will stop using it, and it becomes unacceptable to introduce it as a form of communication. On the other hand, if people are allowed to get away with it and they see it's effective, they see they put people on the defensive, gives them a shot at humiliating another individual, then they're going to keep on doing it until they're called out on it and told that it's not part of our culture, it's not part of who and what we are.
Yeah, well, our lives are to be changing culture. I was amazed by the book, which I, again, perused, at least the summary of it, because I lost my original one, about how to win friends and influence people, is the importance of the relationships that are built between people. How to make people feel good, if you want to put it that way, and not just feel like you can stick them. I know one person that I had working for me at one time, I said, you can't just poke people in the eye. They don't like that. I mean, when you get poked in the eye, you're not going to give an answer, even if it's correct or in some way you will be totally 100% correct. People don't like to be poked in the eye.
Right,
And that's what conversational terrorism is. It's something which really causes uproar. The book that I really enjoy too, that I really like, is Games People Play. They create an atmosphere of uproar. That way they don't have to answer anything, because everything is just, they're already mad at one another. They just, this is a game, one of the games of marriage. They'll never get to anything because so much uproar has been created that you just don't want to talk anymore, which would really solve the problem.
Sure.
But I feel like it's really, really important to have people understand how you feel or how you make the other person feel as a result of the comments that you make. If there's disrespect, if there's dishonor, you're not going to get anywhere. The person will keep. This is what I have found in working with disputes between people. Found out that it really wasn't the issue at hand. It was how they felt about it, how they felt about one another. And between people at various levels, in the church or organization. So I think that's very, very important.
I do too. I'd like to mention one that was used against me that I think is unique. So I was in a conversation with someone who decided to take a cheap shot at me, and he said, Greg, did your mother have any children that lived? Oh. And that was like a double. That was intended to be a double zinger. First of all, he's implying that I'm mentally stillborn. Right? I'm mentally deficient. I can't get it. I'm brain dead.
Don't exist.
And then he introduces my mother. He puts down my mother and introduces my mother with that cheap shot. And they think they're going to win you over. That's the thing that kills me. They think they're going to eventually convince you to their position by throwing a cheap shot at you. And all it's going to do is make you dig in your heels. And if you throw enough cheap shots at an individual, even when they realize they're wrong, they won't admit it. They'll just dig in their heels for being offended, for being mistreated, and they'll maintain their position come hell or high water.
I'm certain in this list that I will include in the show notes on this podcast, the couple who created it comment about the fact that it's not just looking at what people do, it's what they have done themselves, things that they had to understand about themselves and how they talk and how they communicate. There are statements made from the guide that we use in our lives. Do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen. And I feel that statements like that cover so much if they could be the overriding factor in just every secular conversation, every way we talk to our neighbors or to anybody else. This would be a much better world.
Yeah, amen to that.
Anyway, this was a very good discussion, Greg, about conversational terrorism, because it is something that we are immersed in every day. We hear at least 25,000, 30,000 words a day. It depends upon the kind of work that we do. And in the midst of all those thousands and thousands of words, there could be those words that really affect our thinking, our relationships. So I appreciate your continuing our series here on leadership, and especially this subset of conversational terrorism. Thank you so much, Greg.
Well, thank you, Vic. It's great to be back with you again, and I'm looking forward to our next podcast together.
Well, I thank you very much. I'm glad you said that. You can find out more about him on his website, LeadershipExcellenceNow.com, and I will put this back on our website or in the show notes as well, so that you can go there, plus subscribing to his YouTube channel. So thank you very much. We appreciate you, and we'll be thinking about you in anticipation of the next podcast. We thank you, our listeners, for joining us here today for the KUBIK Report. If you have enjoyed this podcast, please share it and tell your friends about it. We can be found on a variety of platforms, including Podbean, which includes information about this podcast, Apple and Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, Audible, Pocket Caster, and other podcasting platforms. You can easily find us on any browser address bar by simply typing in the words, the KUBIK Report, and there we are. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear your impressions and suggestions. So write to us at thekubik@gmail.com, thekubik@gmail.com. Again, thank you for listening. Come back soon for more.